In this video lesson, we'll begin the Civil War and we'll look at advantages and disadvantages of the North and the South. The Crittenden Compromise. As a last-ditch compromise, Senator Crittenden, pictured here, proposed drawing the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Lincoln rejected this since it would expand slavery, and Lincoln was against the expansion of slavery. The South was excited about forming their new country, which they were going to call the Confederate States of America. They held rallies and shot off fireworks. This is a map of the slave states that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861, and they can be seen in the green color. Slave states that seceded from the Union after the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861 can be seen in the color here in peach. Slave states that remained loyal to the Union can be seen in the pink color, and they are Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Free states can be seen in purple, and then the free territories can be seen in the orange color, just like you labeled on your map in our activity last week. Lincoln believed that it was illegal to secede from the Union. He believed that if a state had to apply for admittance, he thought states should also have to ask for permission to leave. Fort Sumter was located at the mouth of the Charleston Harbor, and the South wanted to keep this strategic fort, which was in the hands of the Union. Abraham Lincoln would not allow the South to take this fort because it was federal property, and it was part of the Union fort system. When the fort ran low of supplies, Lincoln alerted the South Carolina governor that unarmed supply ships would be entering the port. Confederate soldiers chose to fire upon the fort for 34 hours. Union Major Anderson surrendered the fort on April 14, 1861. Lincoln asked the Union states to begin to provide troops to fight the war, and the troops were initially asked to enlist for 3 months at a time. Southern states that had not yet seceded from the Union had to decide what to do. Virginia is actually going to split in two, and the people who are living in what's present-day West Virginia decide that they do not want to secede and go with the South and form the Confederacy, that they want to actually remain with the Union, and that's why West Virginia becomes West Virginia. It becomes its own state. Once the war broke out, many men had to decide for which cause to fight. Families were also separated over the war. The advantages and disadvantages of the North and South are very plain to see. The North had 22 million people, as opposed to the South only having 9 million, and 3.5 million of them were slaves. The North was 85% manufacturing, while the South had very few factories. The North had 22,000 miles of railroad track, while the South only had 9,000 miles. The North, although, lacked generals, and there were very trained military leaders in the South, so this was definitely a plus for the South. The South had very little money, but the North had many resources to be able to support the war effort. The South was fighting on their own land because they were fighting a largely defensive war and making the North come to them, and so those are all advantages. The North, although they had lots of supplies, they had to carry them into enemy territory, which was very difficult to do. So that tended to be a disadvantage. The South had pig iron only in Virginia, while the North had 20 times more pig iron than the South. The North had 1,300,000 workers, while the South only had 110,000 workers at their disposal. There were 110,000 factories in the North, while there were only 1,800 factories in the South. The North had 32 times the amount of firearms and weaponry than the South did, because they had very few firearms. Here's a bar chart that shows the resources of the North and South. You can see that the Union is represented by the blue color, and the South, the Confederacy, is represented by the yellow color. So these are the same numbers that I just gave you on the previous page, but you can definitely see that in most cases it is the North that definitely has more resources and outweighs the advantages of the South. Perhaps the biggest Southern advantage was Robert E. Lee, who will become general and will lead the Confederate Army. He was initially asked by Abraham Lincoln to lead the Union Army, but Lee refused because he was from Virginia and he felt that he was unable to turn his back on his home. Robert E. Lee is pictured here. At the beginning of the war in 1861, the Northern Army was more than twice as large as the Southern Army. Men had to pledge that they were over 18 years of age in order to be able to fight, but boys as young as 9 acted as drummer boys. The South enacted legislation to prevent large landowners from leaving their plantations and their slaves to fight. So basically, this was called a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because the people who were really doing the fighting for the Confederacy were poor farmers in the South, not the plantation owners who needed to remain back on the plantation and continue to produce cotton and to make sure that the plantations continued to operate. And we'll discuss more about the advantages and disadvantages and their impact on the beginning of the war when we talk about it in our lessons in class.